5 years ago, I first met our lunch and keynote speaker during the summer of my freshman year. She came to speak to the students of the Educational Opportunity Program here at Stony Brook. As an EOP student, for my Africana Studies class, I conducted an interview with Ms. Johnson on the impact of African American women in education from the year 1865 until now. Back then, I selected Ms. Johnson as a woman to interview because her summary of skills, abilities, and accomplishments in education inspired me. She was an inspiration back then and since further developed her professional self to the phenomenal woman she is today. Tonjanita Johnson is currently the Vice President for Communications and Marketing at the University of Tennessee. Prior to her appointment with the University of Tennessee, Johnson served for 3 years as Chief Deputy to the President at the State University of New York at Stony Brook, where she also held a faculty appointment in the Stony Brook University School of Professional Development, teaching higher education leadership. From 2008 to 2010, Johnson served as Associate Vice President for Marketing and Communications at Middle Tennessee State University. While there, she also assisted the university president with executive communications and was a member of the faculty in the MTSU College of Mass Communication, teaching public relations. From 2001 to 2008, Johnson served in a series of progressively more responsible positions at Mississippi Valley State University in Itta-Bena, where she also served as a faculty member. A year after joining MVSU as Director of Public Relations, Johnson was promoted to Chief of Staff and Executive Assistant to the President, a post she held for 5 years. She concluded her service there as Executive Assistant to the President and Associate Vice President for University Relations. Her career began in 1991 as a newspaper reporter for the Decatur Daily in Decatur, Alabama. She was on the communication staffs of the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa from 1993 to 1996. And worked as a graphic designer, copy editor, freelance, writer, and communication consultant from 1996 to 2001 in New Orleans. Johnson began her college career at the University of Alabama in the summer of 1987 as a New York Times scholar. She earned both of her bachelor's and master's degrees from UA in mass communications in 1991 and 1996, respectively. She also earned a PhD in 2006 in urban higher education from Jackson State University in Jackson, Mississippi, where she served as an Ayers Fellow in the Jake Ayers Institute for Urban Research. In 2008, she completed the Institute for Education Management at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Johnson, who maintains an active speaking and presentation schedule on topics related to her profession, is currently serving a 3-year term as Commissioner on the Council for Advancement and Support of Education's Commission for Communication and Marketing, and is a member of the Board of Directors of the historic Tennessee Theater. A native of Butler, Alabama, here in New York to share her journey, Woman on a Mission, on my way with a story to tell, please help me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Tonjanita Johnson.
Many thanks, Taisha, for that very long introduction. For those of you who sat in on the session related to introverts this morning, it was wonderful. You know that preparing to speak and walking up here, I call it the Green Mile, because it's just before death before I get up here and start to crash and burn. You know, it's been really nice to see many colleagues and friends today. Carol Landoro came up to me, said she's here to hear the many pearls of wisdom that I have to offer this afternoon. And I told her, I said, by the time I finish, they may be Mardi Gras beads instead of pearls. But I am totally thrilled to be here at this great women's symposium. You know, I was telling someone earlier that I remember sitting in the office with Patricia many times, talking about her great dream and vision for what she wanted to see here at Stony Brook related to women. And my goodness, it almost fills me up to be able to look across this room and see the women here and the men who've come in support for this great cause. And you'd be surprised at how many great things start just in a little room somewhere, somebody talking about an idea. And so, Patricia, you should be very proud to see this. And as I mentioned, I am glad to see, you know, a few men scattered about in the audience. As my grandmother would say at home, at church on Women's Day, you know, it's good to recognize men who have the courage to show up in a program focused on women, because it shows that they are smart enough to know where the power is and the best lunch. But seriously, to the gentlemen in the audience, we value your presence and the support of this symposium. And I'm really glad to see so many women here, because I consider myself truly fortunate when I look back over my career and my life and realize that I have enjoyed professional environments where women were supported and celebrated. And that is no more evident to me today when I look across this room and I see colleagues that I worked with from the President's office and other departments. And I know I haven't gotten a chance to see all of you, and I know I'll be rushing out. So if you know me, you've seen me before, you heard my name, just wave at me so I can, oh my goodness. I tell you, I am just delighted to be in this mix with all of you today. It reminds me again of how important all of you are to my story, and even thinking about the role that the president here has even played in my story. You all are a very significant part of my life and a part of my story, and that's what I'm here to talk to you a little bit about today. The importance of having a story and the value of sharing that story for the benefit of yourself and others. You know, most people who know me reasonably well know that I'm kind of like the Brothers Grimm. I'm always somebody with a story. I'm filled with stories. If you're a Golden Girls fan, you would describe me as a younger African-American version of Sophia Petrillo. And she's a character that I love because, you know, you think about it. Every time Sophia opened her mouth, you know, she always started with this, picture this. And that's just kind of how my life is. It's about, picture this. And you always knew that a story was in the making. And unlike Sophia, whose tales would always start somewhere in the distant past in some remote part of Sicily, mine usually involved my late grandmother, who was one of the wisest and funniest women that I knew. And it is filled with experiences of growing up in the Deep South, a journey with all of its interesting challenges that I wouldn't trade for anything, as it has added so much beautiful color to my world. I guess one of the questions I've gotten since I've been here is, how is Tennessee? It's Tennessee. But I do enjoy it. Most folks know I'm Southern. I'm Southern to the bone, but this is a place that's home for me. And it really is good to be here, because putting all of these things together, it's a good mix when you start telling a story. But it is in this world, this bright, colorful world that I think about, that I learned the great value of being a woman. A woman always on a mission and always having a meaningful story to tell. And believe it or not, I learned this from one of my uncles, a man whom it would probably take a lifetime for most people to understand, because you never knew how he was going to approach you. You never knew if it would be in seriousness or in jest, or if he would approach you with any words at all, for that matter. One thing you could be sure of, however, was that he was never going to approach you in any way that would be construed as normal. He was very Southern, but he was not a hugger. I know most folks think that Southerners are huggers, and we are, but he was not. And he certainly had no intention of extending any kind of greeting that sounded like, good morning, hello, how are you? His name was Lewis, but we always called him Bowley. And if I were introducing my Uncle Bowley to you for the first time, the first words that would come out of his mouth after he looked at you from head to toe would be, "What's your story?" And it was never in one of those ice-breaking kind of tones. You know, that conversation started. It wasn't one of these, it's so nice to meet you. What's your story? It was more of a subtle interrogation, jivey kind of tone to it. So, what's your story? And story always sounded like that. It was a story. The way he asked the question, it left the person standing there in what appeared to be kind of awkward confusion. Then they would look at me or whoever else was standing there as if to ask, is he serious? Does he expect a response? Or some were left just smiling and looking rather bewildered, as if those two expressions were going to make Uncle Bowley magically disappear. And if I brought someone home, usually I had the good sense enough to explain to them that my uncle was quite a character, and if they had an opportunity to run into him, that they should not be concerned, just go with the flow. But the one time I brought someone home and forgot to warn them about Uncle Bowley was the first time I ever saw him immediately impressed with a response to his infamous question. It was many years ago when I brought my friend Lois with me to our family reunion. At age 18, Lois was a young woman of some girth and stature, and she had a self-concept and a spirited personality that was even larger than she was. If you ever met Lois, you couldn't help but like her because it was evident that Lois really liked herself. It was not in a conceited kind of way. It was just, Lois was a self-confident individual. We were walking around chatting and, I wasn't even paying attention, and my uncle just seemed to have popped up out of nowhere. And all of a sudden I remembered, I didn't tell Lois. And I immediately and very clumsily said, Lois, I'd like for you to meet my Uncle Bowley. He gave her the once-over, and he kind of scanned the middle and went down. I said, oh, no, here we go. And sure enough, he greeted her with the usual question, what's your story? And without a moment's hesitation, Lois replied, well, how much time do you have, Uncle Bowley? She grabbed him by the arm and she took him off in another direction. Just left me standing there. And I thought, my goodness, I didn't know what to think. But then I said to myself, oh well, knowing Lois, she's got this. Later that day, after my uncle was preparing to leave the gathering, he came by where Lois and I were standing, and he just simply said, I like that gal. And he walked off. It wasn't long after that I had an opportunity to ask him why he went around asking people, what's your story? And he said, I've traveled all around the world. And people who have a purpose and a passion for something always have a real story to tell. It's easy to meet and forget people who don't have a story. So always be a woman with a story to tell, because it makes people think about who you are and how they look at you. Now, whether it's a good story or not so good story, that just depends on what kind of storyteller you are, but that's another matter. Now get on before I have to charge you for this. As strange as that conversation was to me, over time I found a lot of truth in it. My approach to virtually every aspect of my life has gotten easier and better defined as I have learned to use my life experiences and elements of my story in achieving personal and professional goals. I've learned to incorporate pieces of my story in how I work, how I write, how I parent, how I mentor, and even in how I have explored job opportunities. And it's something that I encourage others to do, because understanding your own story is not only the beginning of opening doors for yourself, but also for positively impacting the stories of others. So for the remaining minutes of my presentation, I would like to focus in on being able to really encourage you to think more deeply about what it means to have a story and how it changes how others see you and even how you see yourself. I want to focus on three important roles of a story in your life. The first is that a story gives you significance. Secondly, a story makes you both reflective and it gives vision. And third, a story leaves footprints and inspiration from which others can gain direction and strength. But before I go any further, let me set a foundation for the rest of my talk with this statement. There is no such thing as an ordinary woman. There is no such thing as an ordinary woman. I needed to say this at this point because some of us try to determine how important we are based on how facts have played out in our lives and how others connect those facts with success or failure. But the truth of the matter is, no matter how great your life statistics are from the perspective of others, there are always going to be people who think you're not good enough, that you've not done enough, and that you have failed to meet some standard that they have set in their minds. I don't care how boring you think your life is compared to others. I don't care how extraordinary other people seem to be or how glamorous their lives might appear on Facebook. There is nothing average or ordinary about the person that you are. As a matter of fact, you have been assigned a role that no other person in this role can play, and that is being uniquely you. And if there is no other good news to glean from this presentation today, take that nugget and run. I can't imagine there being any other Tonjanita better than I am. I'm so good I can have my own, when you got a name like Tonjanita at AOL.com, that's easy enough. So there's nobody else who can be me. And I've learned to love that. You define success, and you define a life well lived. And that's why every woman needs a story. Not a tall tale filled with exaggerations and someone else's interpretations of who they think you should be, but rather those truths, those encounters, those experiences that have molded you for better or for worse into the exceptional individual that you are. How many of you in this room have heard of Dr. Frances Brisbane? Just raise your hand. If you're a woman in this room and you don't know Dr. Frances Brisbane, wave your hand again, Dr. Brisbane. You should know this lady. And for those of you who know her, can you imagine someone telling Frances Brisbane that she's not important enough to have a story? I didn't think so. This phenomenal woman is a role model for me. And like her, no one gets to tell me that I'm not important enough to have a story. I don't want people measuring me by someone else's story. And you shouldn't want that either. There's a script that is unique to each of us, with its highs and lows and triumphs and disappointments, gains and losses and tears and fears and laughter that make us the women that we are. And at the end of the day, when I'm no longer able to tell my own story, I want people who knew me best to be able to just say, I refuse to be sad because I can't stop thinking about how she valued each of life's experiences and how she embraced life, both the good and the bad, while she lived. In order to have that kind of story, you have to take the time to define who you are and believe that the life you have been given has significance. In essence, you have to believe that you matter. Look at your neighbor and say, you matter. A little louder, you matter. Don't you hate when people do that? I only did that to get back at you all for the many times I've had to do that in church. But I say all that to say that a story gives you significance. Herminia Ibarra and Kent Lineback wrote a piece in the Harvard Business Review back in 2005 called What's Your Story? One of the first things they sought to explain was why you need a story. They said, stories define who we are. To know someone well is to know her story, the experiences that have shaped her, the trials and turning points that have tested her. It's a great article. If you have a chance, go back and try to look at it. But I also add that story involves the people who influenced her. But you know, reading this piece confirmed to me that our story is not simply a matter of spitting out a series of countless facts, but rather our ability to give appropriate context to our experiences and recount the resulting impact in a manner that brings a more meaningful form to our facts. In Ibarra and Lineback's words, without a story, there is no context to make the facts of our lives meaningful to others. So by creating and telling a story, we bring a sense of significance, unity, and purpose to our lives. In addition, developing our story helps us to believe in ourselves, and it gives us a greater sense of empowerment. Many of us have this misguided notion that only the rich and famous and those with great causes or life experiences that resonate with a broad public can have a story. But that's not true. Sometimes I find it easier to see myself in the stories of those who are right around me every day as opposed to those whose lives seem so distant and different, because I can identify with the things that they're dealing with on a day-to-day basis. But the first step in creating your own story, it is in believing that you are important enough to have a story in the first place. And from there, the work begins. As rewarding as it is to find a place of comfort and truth when it comes to defining ourselves, the process of developing and thinking through one's life story is often a challenging one. The first thing you discover after you've decided that there is a story behind all of these facts in your life is that this whole process takes you out of your comfort zone. You are forced to think about successes and failures. Your mind wanders to people that you'd rather forget and lessons that you learned the hard way. You think about doors that were open and those that were closed. And you think about how those impacted your decisions and your next steps. You reopen wounds that you thought were long healed, and you're faced with thoughts about how open you want to be and how much of a story that you want to share. If you wanted to get some inspiration this morning, you should have come to the introverts meeting. You would not have believed how full that room was of people who consider themselves more internal. And so this process of storytelling, when you think about this whole notion of developing a story to tell a story, that's a pretty concerning piece of information. So when you think about all of these things that come with developing and telling that story, it may be enough for some of you to just close the book right there. But before you give up, and before you talk yourself out of the process, think about what goals are important to you in developing your story, and find what achieving these goals are worth to you. And you may discover that some of the anguish that you go through in developing this story may be well worth it. For me, I wanted to develop my story for three primary reasons: my daughter, my career, and my sanity. A few years ago, as I saw my daughter headed into her teenage years, I realized that I wanted to raise her in an environment where she felt comfortable to ask me anything about growing up and becoming a young woman. I wanted her to be able to draw from my experiences and my life lessons where possible. I didn't want her to rely on myths and half-truths about life from her friends or the internet. Do you know the things that friends and the internet can teach a young woman these days? I didn't want her to think that any conversation was off limits with me because I was her mom. And believe me, she's posted up some doozies. But I knew if I wanted to be that way with her, if I wanted to be able to share important parts of my story like that with her, that I would have to make some peace with some things in my own life and find a new place of honesty with others. And I think when you think about if family is one of the reasons why you want to strengthen something there with your story, that's a good place to start. In terms of my career, I began to see higher levels of career opportunities being presented to me. But the truth of the matter was that they were coming at me faster than I was prepared to keep up. I can remember applying for the job here at Stony Brook as chief deputy. And one of the reasons why this job interested me so was because I'd read the story of the president. I thought, okay, here's a man coming into his first presidency. He's a researcher. I don't know what his bedside manner is. This is where I come in, thinking to myself, you can come in and bring a different level of something that may be missing from his perspective because he's been so used to being on the higher end of research. But I thought to myself when I sent in my application, I said, now you know, this is probably a big waste of time. Little southern girl out of Tennessee thinking she's going to New York. Right. When I got the call, it nearly scared me to death. They called back. And what I realized from that, this whole feeling of nervousness, because again, you know, when you say New York down south, it all looks the same. It's skyscrapers and it's concrete. It's where the big wheels live. And my parents were like, New York? What in the world are you gonna do in New York? And my brother was like, that ain't gonna happen. That girl is country as a sack of potatoes. She's not going to any New York. But what I realized from that is that there were pieces of my story that I wanted to contribute here. And there were other parts of my story that I wanted to develop here. I needed to be able to explain to my employer that there was something different about me. Because when you think about it, you know, I know even being here, when we would post jobs, sometimes those jobs would have hundreds upon hundreds of applicants. How do you differentiate yourself? And I wanted to be seen as being different from other people in the pool. I also wanted my colleagues to be able to see that my experiences and my abilities, even though they were quite different from theirs, had a different level, had a similar value. And that was important to me. So for some of you, career may be the reason why you're seeking the opportunity to tell your story. But finally, and in some instances more important to me, I needed to develop a story for my sanity. I needed to find my true self, and I needed to be released from some of the self-imposed pressure that I was feeling to be the perfect wife, the model older sibling, the constant problem solver at work, and all-around superwoman everywhere that I went. And I know we don't have any superwomen in here. I just wanted to peel the S off of my chest and just be the best woman that I could be without feeling constantly overwhelmed. And so for me, being able to tell this story, to say the least, and working through all of this, it was therapeutic and it was empowering. It was a process full of emotions, secret confessions, changing the names of some characters to protect the innocent or the guilty, as it may have been, acknowledging the influences, both good and bad, of some people that I had encountered, and looking at areas of growth and places of stagnation. And while this process gave me a much better sense of how I had become the woman that I was, it also gave me a great sense of excitement and hope about the woman that I was yet to become. Finally, a story leaves footprints and inspiration for others. The thing that has been most rewarding for me than anything else in this process is using my story to provide guidance and hope to others who are able to find something in my experiences that enhance their life's journey and adds to their story. My husband swears that I will go to depths unknown to help another woman succeed. And to that, I guess I am guilty as charged. And that's primarily because I am a product of so many people, especially women, who have helped me. So I mentor students, I invest in the personal and professional growth of those around me, and I have connected with countless women that I don't even know, reviewing resumes, prepping them for employment interviews, or just being a listening ear. But in every encounter, I try to leave a little piece of my story behind. And all of that to say, in order for a story to be useful to others, it has to be told. So as I wrap all of this up, in spite of the many challenges that remain for women around the world, this is a fantastic time to be a woman or to support the dreams of the women around you. Women have a long history of nurturing, building, and creating that which brings life, results, and even change. Give me a woman who has embraced these ideas, and I give you a woman with a story. The only question that remains is, what's your story? Thank you so much. I appreciate it.